Now, continuing with the debate about the racial origins of the ancient Egyptians, again, the ancient literature, that of the Hebrews, the Jews, the Greeks and Romans, and into the medieval period, classified the ancient Egyptians together with the Ethiopians as both dark-skinned people with crisp, frizzy hair and having a similar biological descent, ancestry. For example, in the Bible, they are both descendants of Ham, the one of the sons of, I think it's one of the sons of Noah, if I'm not mistaken. And during the early part of the 19th century, I think I said 18th century in the last video, but it was in the 19th century, the early part of it, that there was a debate that while the Egyptians and Ethiopians were related, they were related to each other, but they were a sort of a darker skinned Caucasian race, both of them. And that was an early attempt to create a racial theory, part of a wider attempt to create a racial theory on civilization and to separate peoples like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. You know, the Ethiopians had civilizations like, well, I won't go into those, but they had their own civilizations. And they wanted to separate them and to classify them as part of the darker-skinned Caucasian races. Now, in the modern debate, it differs now because modern Egyptologists, well, the Western Egyptologists, they no longer try to classify ancient Egyptians with ancient Ethiopians. Ethiopians have become black peoples, basically, in modern science, in the Western, view of things, Eurocentric view of things. They've given up the idea of, generally speaking, for the most part, Ethiopians have become an African, a black African, quote-unquote, race. Maybe a mix. There's still argument that they've been heavily mixed, but there's no longer a attempt to classify them as a Caucasian race, not the Ethiopians. It is still the idea that the ancient Egyptians were a Caucasian race. That still exists today as part of the Afrocentric debate on the ancient Egyptians. But this is a centuries-old debate. And as I said before, that African scholars from the continent of Africa, African scholars from the Caribbean, from Europe, have all gotten involved in this. It's become a very political as well as a scientific debate. But it's changed. It's changed. As I said before, in the earlier periods, a lot of peoples, including the Ethiopians, the peoples of India, and that hasn't totally changed in India. Well, for example, the Dravidian peoples of India and a number of other darker-skinned peoples around the world that were associated with certain civilizations were separated out as part of the dark-skinned Caucasian races. That hasn't totally gone away yet. That idea, that theory, hasn't totally disappeared, although it's not nearly as strong as it was in the early to middle parts of the 19th century. And today, well, before I get to what the argument is today, around the start of the 20th century, the theories on Egypt began to focus instead on an invading people this dynastic race where the theory was that Caucasians from West Asia invaded Egypt and established themselves there, and that those Caucasians were the ones that they basically started the Egyptian civilization. So that was the new direction in the debate that started around the beginning of the 20th century. With people like Petrie. He was an Egyptologist who really pushed this idea of a new intrusive group of people, a new racial group that moved into Egypt and they set up the system, the governmental system of the pharaohs, for example. Now, I don't think he suggested that they brought the language. I'd have to review that, but at the very least, they adopted the local language, but still they were basically the Caucasian creators of the Egyptian civilization. And that was part of this. It had the same general idea of the earlier Egyptologists, that it was, from a racial point of view, only Caucasians who had this creativity, this organizational skill, or whatever, or biologically inherited capability of creating civilization. That was the whole point of the theory of race as it rose around the early parts of the 19th century and the latter parts of the 18th century. This whole idea of race, and race as a part of a policy of racial superiority that was beginning already at that early stage. And I'll talk more about this later.